Eddie Tudorano. I'm a professor of information science at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, and I'm serving as a track co-producer alongside Samantha Maxim and Prashant Sutikal. We're doing this for track G, which is virtual, and it deals with global issues in data, analytics, and management. It is my pleasure to introduce the next session, Actionable Ethics Framework for Data and Analytics. And in this session, you'll hear about a framework for managing the potential risks posed by topics such as ethics and responsibility, but particularly for organizations that are heavily reliant on data, for data organizations. Before I hand things over to our speaker, a couple of things I want to mention. First, this session is being recorded, and any presentations that are presented here will be included in the symposium proceedings. And then the video recording will be uploaded to the CDOIQ YouTube channel in about 3 months. And then at the end of the session, there will be a questions and answers section. If you have anything, please, we're going to use the Whova platform to submit a question, and please kind of go to the Q&A tab and ask your questions. With that, I'll turn things over to this session speaker, Patrick Bangert, Senior Vice President of Data, Analytics, and AI at Sears. And Patrick, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Eddie. Thank you to all of you for taking out your time this afternoon to listen to me talk about ethics. I'm Patrick Bangert. I work for Sears, where I've joined 3 months ago as SVP of Data Analytics and AI. Prior to that, I spent 3 years working at Samsung, where I headed up the AI division. And what I'm going to present to you today is a framework that we made at Samsung, and we rolled out over all the global AI business units at Samsung to govern all of the projects and products that come out. Now I'm using it at Sears to govern the projects in Google Cloud. So this is a framework that has been used for a number of projects already, and it's been found to be practical as well as I said, actionable. So first of all, let's look at some of the challenges that ethics poses, or that AI poses to ethics. We've all heard that, AI, particularly generative AI, the sort of thing that you hear about under the name large language models, or GPT-3, GPT-4, Chat GPT, all of those names essentially refer to an AI model that generates text, audio, and images based on a prompt that you give it. So you essentially are able to have a conversation with this. I'm sure many of you have at least tried it out privately. There are numerous circumstances where people have had an interaction somewhat similar to a psychologist, where the AI has recommended them to commit suicide. Some people have. There are issues where people are identified as male or female based on things like their name. Models have been generated that, based on a normal photograph, can strip away clothing and present the people as naked. There are models that have been meant to track soccer games by following the ball on the field and identifying where the goals have been scored. And it's been found that they can't distinguish between a ball, the soccer ball itself, and a player that's had a shaven head. So things of that nature pose real challenges, because people are being discriminated against based on all sorts of criteria. On their skin color, on their physiological structure, like having a bald head, on their name, on their sexuality, on their male, female, or otherwise nature. These are discriminatory practices that we as a society, of course, don't want. But AI, in various guises, still has them. Now, the danger, of course, of AI being biased in this way versus an individual person being biased in exactly the same way, the challenge really is in the scale that AI poses, right? So if a person is discriminatory, that the damage caused by that person is kind of restricted by the radius that that person has. But AI, particularly through the cloud, can of course have global impact, and therefore the damage done by that bias is now at scale. It's also pretty cheap to replicate and deploy these models, so that there is, once the model is made, there is hardly any cost associated with deploying that bias or that discriminatory behavior. In other words, the ethics challenges are of a different nature, even though they are grounded on the same reality, just by the fact that the economics work out differently. And so we need to think about what to do. Not only, though, is the challenge discriminatory or bias. There are some use cases that are inherently unethical. So for instance, there is a drone, so an autonomous flying object like a helicopter or a little airplane that has attached guns with an AI system that is capable of distinguishing combatants from non-combatants and will automatically shoot them. Now, of course, every single AI model made to date, and I am perfectly positive in the future, has a certain accuracy that is less than 100%. In other words, every model will make mistakes. So if you try to distinguish combatants from non-combatants, you're going to make mistakes. In other words, you're going to shoot civilians. That in itself is, not a discrimination of African Americans versus white or women against men or something. This is a discrimination against humanity as a whole. And I think most of us, if not all of us, would consider that to be unethical, right? So ethics is more than just bias. It has to do with a broader sense of ethics. Is the use case ethics ethical? Is it ethical to use AI for this particular use case, or should we be using another technology? Is there a bias involved, in which case against whom, and so on. But what is ethics in the first place? Well, virtually every civilization in human history has come up with its own ethics code. And I apologize to begin with that, due to the time that I have available, I'm only going to go into the Western tradition, but there are plenty of other traditions out there. There's a very strong Eastern tradition coming out of places like India and China. There's a strong African tradition, particularly with the Ubuntu philosophy that I am human because you are human and interact with me. In other words, ethics and morality is very much an interactivity between people, and we kind of define ourselves as a network. I want to go into a little bit of what various of the ancient Europeans said. So, for example, Aristotle said that the purpose of ethics is to achieve the golden mean between an excess of too much and too little. And we have to strike that medium with practical wisdom. So the emphasis on being practical. Abelard, on the other hand, was more of a religious guy. He says it's the intention that really counts. And the intention is to be assessed according to what he called the natural law, which is defined by the Bible, essentially. Hobbes was a more statistical guy. He said it's ethical if it's the greatest good for the greatest number of people, that is. That's the goal of ethics. So you have to assess how many people are being impacted and how they're being impacted to effectively calculate which is the more ethical option. Kant, the most recent guy here, developed the categorical imperative, which is to say you should act in a manner that your action should be generalizable to a universal law so that everybody should always act like this. In other words, you shouldn't really be making one-off exceptions. These are some of the utterances, and you can read a gigantic literature on this topic. So there is no universal standard on what is ethical. So these four European representatives said some very different things that are not necessarily compatible. And as I said, the African tradition, the Asian tradition, et cetera, are not the same either. In other words, there is no universal agreement on what is ethical and what is moral to do in practical circumstances. And so there's, of course, definitely no standard for artificial intelligence ethics, which is extremely new, since artificial intelligence has really only been around for the last 5 or 6 decades. Technologically, however, we are mostly Aristotelian, which is to say that we try to achieve a balance between an excess and a deficiency of something. And I'll go into that in a moment. Ethics, in my view, really needs to be part of the development of a piece of technology, software, AI model that starts with the use case. So we have to identify what we're meant to do and make that be ethical, only do use cases that are ethical. We need to formulate a goal for that artificial intelligence. And since AI is a branch of mathematics, the goal is necessarily a mathematical entity. You will be familiar, if you ever looked at training of AI models, is that they have a so-called loss function that is being minimized. So you have to define what exactly it is that you want to minimize. That gives meaning to the term accuracy. Then, of course, you carry out that training process by considering a great many options and slowly zeroing in on the best one. There are multiple choices here that are under the name algorithm, right? So the training is related to the algorithm, the methodology of carrying out that learning process. Having the finished model in your hands, however, is not the end result, because using AI in real life almost always comes down to making a decision. And it is generally humans who make that decision. And in a few isolated cases, the computer directly makes the decision. And it is the decision that carries with it a benefit or a drawback, because you have to actualize whatever the AI put out. And of course, that benefit or drawback could be measured in monetary terms or in other terms. And again, that's something we have to think about, how we're going to measure the benefit. But modeling is never done. Models do have to be kept up to date because the world changes, and therefore model performance degrades over its lifetime. And so you constantly have to gather more data, retrain the model, deploy the new version, gather more data, retrain the model, and so on. You'll note that in retail examples where we try to model consumer behavior, we generally have to retrain once a week. In other circumstances like healthcare, we would retrain once a quarter. But you'll note that none of these time periods are very long. Multiple times a year, the model goes out of date and has to be retrained. So artificial intelligence is not something that you do and deploy and you're done. You are, in fact, entering a life cycle. And that means that the ethical considerations are also not done once and finished, but they have to be carried on throughout the life cycle at regular intervals to make sure that you are still up to snuff. Now, technology, of course, has a particular purpose. It comes back down to the use case. So mathematically speaking, you can define when models are accurate or correct with their output. And as I said, artificial intelligence accuracies are always less than 100%. You will make mistakes. The only question is how many. And of course, what is their cost? You can determine correctness. Is the model in fact correct in every single instance? but that comes at a cost. And so, of course, the very purpose of artificial intelligence is to save you money by automating things, right? The value of artificial intelligence, no matter which use case, is in automation, is in saving cost and time, having to generate the result in some other way. In other words, you cannot actually determine whether the model is correct or not correct in every single instance, because that would defeat the purpose of artificial intelligence in the first place. So you can only determine whether the model is correct in each instance statistically. You're working with probabilities. So in other words, for each individual case, you do not know for certain whether the model is right or not, and you simply have to act on that. Therefore, you will cause some amount of damage, and the question is, how much? And there are two primary cases that we need to distinguish. This is the false positive and the false negative. So you have to identify what are the damages. They do not cancel out because both are mistakes, right? So if you make one false positive and one false negative, it doesn't average out to the same as making no mistakes. No, you have made two mistakes. They're just different mistakes. False positives and false negatives don't necessarily just occur when you identify things, right? This is of a type A versus this is of type B. It also occurs in numerical tasks where you estimate a numerical value. They're just over and underestimations in those cases. So to give you an example, I have a perfectly healthy patient going in for a medical imaging exam, and the artificial intelligence diagnoses that person with cancer. That's called a false positive, right? It's positive for cancer, but it's false because the person is actually healthy. The opposite is your cancer patient comes in for imaging assessment and they're diagnosed as healthy. That's a false negative, right? The AI is negative for cancer, but this is false because the person actually has it. Now, the damage done to the healthy patient is effectively emotional, right? You tell that person you've got cancer, they feel real bad about it, but they're not going to feel bad about it for very long because it's going to be identified within a few days that you've made a mistake. So they're irritated, but they're okay. Now, the cancer patient you diagnose as healthy, they're in trouble because they will also discover that you made a mistake eventually, but maybe not for some time, because they'll go home happy and be complacent. And all the while they're not getting the treatment that they need. And possibly by the time they come back and discover that you've made a mistake, it may be too late, right? So the damage in the healthy patient's case is limited. The damage in the unhealthy patient's case is probably their life. So the damage is not the same, and you have to consider what it is. And so also the probabilities of making a false positive, false negative have to be considered separately. So that's part of being ethical or making an ethics assessment, is identify what can go wrong, what the damages are, and what you're going to do in each of these cases to mitigate the fallout. Now, there are, from an Aristotle point of view, there are some of these virtues that we want to make a trade-off, and the primary ones are variance and bias. So variance is how scattered the results are given the same input, and bias is how much off-center they are, right? You can see a diagram here that compares them. So on the top left here, we have low variance. All the dots are very clustered, but a high bias. It's far off center, right? So what you, of course, want is the lower left, which is a clustered set of points right in the middle of the target. However, in practicality, there's always a trade-off. If you lower the variance, you increase the bias, and you lower the bias, you increase the variance. And so you have to negotiate some sort of medium between these two. And that's why I say that in practicality, the ethical methodology we follow technologically is Aristotle. In other words, we're trying to be between these two extremes. Now, this is one criterion that I've just illustrated, the bias versus variance. This is a technological trade-off that you're making, but you're making other trade-offs as well. For instance, how biased are you, women versus men? How biased are you based on skin color, on ethnicity, on income? These might be criterias 2, 3, 4, and so on. These are what I often call hidden variables. They are variables, of course, because every individual person has an ethnicity and an income and so on and so forth, but they're often hidden in the sense that your data set, your spreadsheet, the table of data that you have to train your AI on may not have columns that have that information in them. So a popular example is that an AI trained on the default probability on a bank loan is inherently biased against women, not because there is a column that gives you male, female to the person, but rather the information male, female is implicit. It is not explicit. It's implicit in other data like income. And therefore, the algorithm will then discriminate against women, not even having known whether certain people are women or not. So my answer to that is we have to make these hidden variables no longer hidden. We have to make them explicit. So we have to bring in a column that says male, female. We have to bring in a column that says ethnicity. And then we have to demand, algorithmically, mathematically demand that the model be completely even on those variables. If those variables are known, if they're explicit, if they're in our database, then we're able to do that very, very easily. We just have to tell the algorithm saying, okay, you're going to minimize a certain accuracy here, maximize the accuracy, minimize the loss function. And you must, as a boundary condition, be completely even keel on these criteria. Now, that, of course, means that you have to identify what those criteria are in your particular case, and you have to collect the data. So that means the hidden variables have to become explicit. You have to, though, to make them explicit, define what the variables are that you are not going to discriminate against, right? So that's the only homework item that comes on top. You have to collect that data. So to put some of these things together, this is the framework that I am presenting here, and in the shape of a little Greek building here from the foundation up. So first of all, the use case at the bottom here. The use case I would assess by intention. What do you intend to do? Yeah, do you intend to kill people? Not so ethical, right? Do you intend to save lives? Pretty okay. Next, what is the goal, the mathematical goal, the loss function to be minimized by the artificial intelligence algorithm? I'd say that too is intentional. So you can assess it by what do you intend to focus on, mathematically speaking. On a third level, you have all sorts of trade-offs. You have a complexity trade-off. How big is the model, right? The bigger the model, the more expensive it is to train, the more expensive it is to execute. They have their own, climate change and whatnot issues associated with them. Then you have the problem of accuracy, which is bias versus variance that I talked about. There's a trade-off right there. And then come the hidden variables that you have to identify. That's the biggest homework here. On top of that comes decision support. Decision support then is, how do I turn the answer coming out of the AI into a real life decision that has a real benefit or drawback in the physical world? That I would base on a utility function. In other words, I would measure the benefits and drawbacks in physical terms, financial, kilograms or, something real, and then make a decision based on the best available option. Lastly, the roof here is life cycle management. Again, the models have to be retrained periodically to keep them up to date. And that I would base on the categorical imperative, which is to say that your actions that you make individually should be able to become a universal law. In other words, the universal law is the one that is being repeated at every cycle during this life cycle to keep your model up to date, so that you use the same philosophy at each iteration to keep everything at least up to date. So that's the basic framework that I would advertise here to be used for your artificial intelligence. How do you actualize this framework is the first step really is to call into being a committee of people that meet on a regular basis to discuss the projects and products of your company that have to do with AI, whether you make the AI yourself or whether you use AI made by other people, whether you use open source or commercial models. Still, the ethical homework is incumbent upon you and your company. So you should create a committee of people. Some people might come from technology and product. Some people might come from customer. Some people might come from legal. You may or may not get an expert AI consultant or ethics consultant. There are now professional companies and people that do full-time ethics consulting, because this is such an important area of work, and that will assist you in actualizing things of this nature to make sure that you are ethical.
Patrick, we have about 3 minutes left.
Thank you for that. I'm about to close with the words of Socrates saying that the unexamined life is not worth living. So we should examine our life, and part of that is how to be ethical and moral. So I would very, very strongly ask all of you to give this some thought on how your company is using, making, deploying artificial intelligence in various use cases, and to give some thought on how ethical that is. As a closing thought, I just leave you with, there are two concrete business risks that come from not thinking about these ethical dilemmas. First of all, of course, you run into some regulatory problems, as a number of jurisdictions around the world have already and will release soon various laws and regulations around the fact that you kind of have to do what I've talked about. The other is that the public at large, who are your customer base or the customer of your customer, do think about this, and there have been multiple cases of companies which didn't run into a regulatory legal problem from an ethics point of view, but which ran into basically the public saying, we're not going to purchase those goods anymore from that company because they're not ethical, right? So you have two business risks that from a purely financial point of view should hopefully motivate you to take this seriously. Apart from that, of course, it's the right thing to do to be ethical and be a good person. Thank you very much for your attention. It's been wonderful to present here. If you have any questions, please go for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. There is a question which was actually asked pretty early in the session. What are the essential elements of an actionable ethics framework that effectively guides the ethical use of analytics in an organization? You may have already covered it, but what do you think it's, I would maybe say, what is the essential and actionable things?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And that's a really important question. Right, so the actionable is what should you do first in a real organization, and my answer to that is you should form an ethics review board. with real people on it that have authority to veto certain projects and products, that have time to actually be on this and not just be on it in name, but actually spend some time investigating these things and learning about what ethics is and means for the company. In terms of the main elements, as I said, I'm focusing here on software and AI concerning with data analytics. So the primary one to start with is the use case, right? What are you going to use this for? What is the answer that you're looking for? Is that even ethical? Then what are the variables you're considering, right? Oftentimes, as I said, the variables we're considering excludes some of these biases that we don't want. And I'm advertising that you should reverse that. You should include in the data set the variables that you do not want to bias against. Only by including them do you have the ability to even assess whether you are biased or not. And only in that way do you have the capability of ruling out bias. All right, so if you're concerned about discrimination based on ethnicity, you must have a column that gives you ethnicity. Otherwise, you will be biased and you won't even know it. And then the third main element is decision support. No database, no analytics, no AI is ever going to harm anybody unless you make a decision and actualize the output. And so you can have additional checks and balances at the point of decision, which is generally made by a human, and make sure that at least at that point you catch any unethical behavior.
Well, thank you very much. And we are a little bit over our time, so I would, any more questions if anybody has, they can ask through the Hubab platform directly to you. And that is the end. And thank you so much, Patrick. Was an interesting take on AI and very practical on AI.
Thank you very much, Eddie. Thank you to the audience. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.